Dear students, by now we have already discussed the conceptual and theoretical aspects of environmental movement. In the two modules of this week, we will focus on India's specific issues of environmental movement. We will basically discuss environmentalism and environmental movement in India and the ideological trends of Indian environmentalism or environmental movements in India. Joan Martinez-Allier, in his book The Environmentalism of the Poor, discusses about three currents of environmentalism. Let us see that what are these three currents of environmentalism and where we can place the Indian environmental movements or Indian environmentalism. Martinez-Allier says that the three currents of environmentalism that is prevalent throughout the globe are the cult of wilderness, gospel of eco-efficiency and environmentalism of the poor. These three currents of environmentalism are quite different from each other. While one finds industrialization problematic, for the other kind of environmentalism, perhaps industrialization is okay, but it requires certain kind of modifications or reforms. However, Martinez-Allier says that these three currents of environmentalism are channels of a single river, they are branches of a big tree and varieties of the same crop. They have lot in common. Let us see what are these three currents of environmentalism and where can we place Indian environmental movements or Indian environmental ideas. With regard to the cult of wilderness, Martinez-Allier says that this ideology of environmentalism does not attack economic growth per se, but fights to preserve the remnants of pristine natural spaces. So, the cult of wilderness arises out of love for nature or deeply held values towards the nature. So, this variety of environmentalism basically requires an ethical attitude and ethical value towards the nature, and it highlights that human pressure on environment has resulted in less and less biomass available for the non-humans. This environmental idea basically tries to argue that the ecosystem or the ecological system is shared by both human and non-human species, and therefore, when human demand on ecosystem increases, that results in less and less amount available for non-humans. In other words, this view of environmentalism demands that we all should share the planet Earth, and humans are not a kind of superior species, and therefore, we have equal share over the resources, over the natural ecosystem as that of non-humans. So, therefore, our excessive demand on ecosystem results in less and less resources available for other non-human species, and therefore, it demands to conserve the ecosystem, it demands to conserve the forest, conserve the water, and basically this environmentalism demands for conservation, preservation of resources not only for human use, but for the entire ecosystem. The second environmental ideas, the gospel of eco-efficiency. This current of environmental thinking grew out of worries about the negative impacts of economic growth or industrialization. So, in this context or in this framework, environmentalism is interpreted in terms of environmental managerialism. So, this view opines that with no pristine or untouched nature left, perhaps eco-efficiency becomes socially, morally and politically more correct, and therefore, you may find that there is a lot of acceptance, there is a lot of acceptance of this model or this view of environmentalism, and the gospel of eco-efficiency manifests itself through several ways, several activities like through sustainable development, through ecological modernization and through resource management. So, the basic focus of this environmentalism is to manage resources, manage the ecosystem in an efficient way, so that human society's dependence upon it can be regulated and nature can serve humanity for posterity, nature can serve humanity for a longer time. So, in this model or in this environmentalism, nature is considered as something which is required, which is essential for human society, and therefore, by preserving the nature, essentially we are preserving human society, we are regulating human society's dependence upon nature. But perhaps what is more interesting in this framework of currents of environmentalism is the last one or the third one. The environmentalism of the poor, as Joan Martinez-Allier points out, it points towards the increased environmental impact of economic growth. It emphasizes geographical displacement of sources and sink. In other words, this variety or this trend of environmentalism highlights that economic growth or industrialization results in certain kind of displacement, certain kind of degradation of resources, degradation or physical degradation of the ecosystem. And this physical degradation of ecosystem, because of the process of development, because of the process of industrialization, creates a kind of distributional ecological conflict, in the sense that there are some group who lay claim over the natural resources, and their claim of natural resources results in less and less resources available for other social groups. In that sense, this variety or this trend of environmentalism talks about ecological distributional conflicts between different social groups, between different human groups or human beings, a group which claims a share over the resource, and that claiming of the share over the resource results in reducing the resources for other groups, and therefore there is a conflict between two human groups. In the sense that these kind of environmental movements are essentially resource based conflicts. And in today's class, the topic that we will discuss, Indian environmentalism, can be categorized in this category, in this trend or in this current of environmentalism. Both Ramchandra Guha and Joan Martinez earlier are of the opinion that the mainstream Indian environmentalism can be grouped or can be categorized in the broad category or the broad rubric of environmentalism of the poor. So, let us understand what is this environmentalism of the poor and how does that manifest in the Indian context. So, the broad objective of today's class, today's module, is to understand the issues, context, nature and manifestation of Indian environmental movement. And while discussing the mainstream literature on Indian environmental movement, towards the end of this module, we will also develop a critique towards that, and we will highlight the major problems of this kind of conceptualization of Indian environmental movement, which we find in the mainstream environmental sociological literature. So, after successfully completing this module, you will be able to distinguish between the mainstream literature on Indian environmentalism or Indian environmental movement and the emerging perspectives, or the critique of the mainstream perspective, the critique of the mainstream ideas of environmentalism or environmental movements in India. So, I basically divided this class into three parts. In the first part, we will discuss Indian environmental movements, the social base and material context. In the second part, we will discuss characteristics or basic traits of Indian environmental movements, and in the third part, we will develop a critique of the mainstream understanding of environmental movements, and we will also discuss the emerging paradigms, the emerging trends of Indian environmental movements. Let us begin with the first part of this lecture, that is conceptualizing Indian environmental movement. So, here basically we will discuss the social base and the material context of Indian environmental movement. Before going to discuss the social basis of Indian environmental movement, let us see what are the major issues of Indian environmental movements. The central issue for Indian environmental movement has been the issue of resource depletion, and Indian environmental movements point out that physical degradation of resources is not the only depletion of, or is not the only negative consequence of industrialization. So, resource depletion may be understood from two aspects. One is the physical consequences of resource depletion and the social or human consequences of resource depletion. Physical consequences like deforestation, loss of biodiversity, pollution, they all definitely create a condition of ecological degradation. We find that our environment is degraded, there is a physical loss to the environmental conditions. But perhaps what is more interesting, perhaps what is more important to understand Indian environmental movements is the social consequences, the human consequences of environmental degradation. Because here these movements point out that the physical degradation is not the only matter of concern of industrialization process or the degradation of nature. Environmental depletions or resource depletion also creates a problem for the society. So, therefore, there is a societal consequence, human consequence of resource depletion. So, these human consequences manifest themselves in the form of loss of livelihood, poverty, powerlessness, exploitation, marginalization, and they also raise issues of ethnicity, caste and gender. So, therefore, the central theme, the central issue to understand Indian environmental movement is that the environmental crisis or the environmental degradation results in social conflicts between competing groups for resource use, because there is a social dimension, human dimensions of environmental degradation, and when there is an environmental degradation, that results in loss of livelihood, that results in increasing poverty and increasing powerlessness. So, therefore, there emerges a social conflict. So, in that sense, Indian environmental movements may be better understood, as Ramchandra Guha argues, as social conflicts over the issue of resource capture. They are social conflicts over the issue of claiming, or they are social conflicts over the issue of putting claim to natural resources. So, what are the implications of these kind of conflicts? These kind of conflicts, so the resource based conflicts of Indian environmental movements, has shifted the attention from one set of productive resources to another, in the sense that, as Ramchandra Guha argues, these are a third kind of class struggle. The attention or the focus has shifted from field, that is from agrarian movement, to that of factory, that is industrial movements, and now to that of the natural resource base, the forest, the water, the grazing lands, the fisheries. So therefore, these environmental movements that we find in India are essentially what Ramchandra Guha and Martinez earlier argues. They are resource based conflicts where the central issue is conflicts over putting claim to resources. Now let us see what are the social basis of these kind of conflicts or these kind of environmental movements. The first important point about Indian environmental movement is that they are multifaceted movements. Unlike the Western environmental movements, the environmental movements in America or in Europe, which are single issue movements, let us say based on pollution, Indian environmental movements are multifaceted movements. Ramchandra Guha says that there is both a private phase and a public phase to these environmental movements. With regard to the private phase, Indian environmental movements are essentially peasant or tribal struggles in defense of the traditional rights over natural resources. So basically what these people are struggling or they are protesting is to claim their local autonomy, is to defend the traditional rights over natural resources. But however, when we see the public face of these movements, these are organized struggles to protect the environment. These are essentially environmental movements. So therefore, while for outside it looks like an environmental movement and a green movement, from inside the private phase, these are essentially conflicts over resources where the local, the tribals or the local people, they claim to establish a local control over the natural resources as opposed to the control by the centralized state. The second factor about Indian environmental movement is the core assumptions. There are certain core assumptions of Indian environmental movement which are essentially different from that of environmental movements that grew up in Northern America or in Western Europe. So Indian environmental movements make it very clear that environmental movement is not a phenomena restricted to the industrialized world, like we have discussed in the post-material hypothesis, which says that environmental movement emerges in a post-material, post-industrial context because the central issue is quality of life, whereas we see that Indian environmental movements emerge in the context of production process. They emerge during the time of industrialization, not after polluting the nature. So in that sense, Indian environmental movements make it very clear that physical depletion, physical degradation is not the only consequence of environmental degradation and also not the only cause of environmental degradation. So therefore, environmental degradation results in kind of loss of livelihood, and they create both environmental damage as well as threat to rural livelihoods. So environmental degradation is not just a physical degradation of the ecosystem, that also results in degradation of the social base of the rural societies or the local societies, where essentially what is at stake, what is questioned, what is threatened is that of livelihood of certain communities who depend upon resources for their day-to-day activities, for their day-to-day livelihood sustenance. The third factor or the third social base of Indian environmental movements is the struggle over process of production and extraction. As I just mentioned, unlike Western or American environmental movements which emerge in the post-industrial context, Indian environmental movements emerge that they grew up over the process of production and resource extraction. In that sense, as Ramchandra Guha argues, these are conflicts over resource capture, modes of resource use and the technology adopted for extraction. So let me give you some examples to understand this concept. So these movements are essentially about capture or control over resources. Who should control the resource? Whether resource should be controlled, managed by the local communities because they have an essential stake over the resource, or resources are national property, or resources belong to the nation state and therefore the state should control these resources. These conflicts also essentially highlight a conflict in mode of resource use, whether resources should be used for livelihood patterns, for livelihood generation or for livelihood sustenance as the local communities use it, or resources should be considered as a raw material which should be monopolized by the capitalist state and should be used, should be exchanged in the process of production to come out with certain kind of outputs. So therefore, essentially Indian environmental movements are a struggle or are a conflict over modes of resource use. Why and how resources should be used, whether it should be used for livelihood generation, for fulfilling the livelihood of local communities, or it should be used for national goals or for process of industrialization or capitalist development. Thirdly, what as Ramchandra Guha says, that these also are conflicts over technology adopted for resource extraction. Like if you see the movement which grew up in the context of fisheries, for example, the Save the Chilika movement, where essentially the conflict was about whether trawlers or whether mechanized boats should be used in the Chilika lagoon, or only the local fishermen, the traditional fishermen should continue fishing with the traditional nets. The central question was that what should be the technology that is supposed to be used, whether the technologies should be localized, whether the technologies should be traditional technologies or the technologies should be modern technology. And why technology becomes important? Because it is the technology which determines how much resources we are extracting. Obviously, with a traditional technology, with a traditional net, we can capture less amount of fish. We can withdraw less amount of resources. We can, with a traditional axe, we can cut less amount of trees. Whereas when we use mechanized technology, resource extraction is perhaps huge. So with a mechanized technology, more and more resources can be extracted, and therefore the central question is what kind of technology should be used to extract resources. The fourth point about Indian environmentalism is that of the conflict between two versions of economy. When we see Indian environmental movement, may it be Chipko, may it be Narmada, may it be Save the Chilika movement, or may it be several conflicts that are emerged in the Indian context, these conflicts essentially highlight that they are conflict between two versions or two types of ecology, two types of economy. That is, the conflict is between the political economy of profit and greed and the moral economy of need. While the state wants to use the resources as a source for raw material, as a source to produce certain kind of profit in a capitalist process, the local communities use these resources for satisfying or fulfilling their basic need. So essentially these conflicts highlight two different versions of economy, one which highlights the political economy of profit, where the central issue is profit generation out of natural resources, other where the central issue is satisfying the basic needs. And finally, these environmental movements or the Indian environmental movements are not just conflicts concerning nature, they are essentially, from an ideological perspective, conflicts about different uses and worldviews of nature. How should we approach the nature, how should we behave with the nature, how should we deal with the nature, whether nature is something which should be used for local needs, for fulfilling local needs or local livelihood requirements, or nature is something which should be used as a raw material, as an input in the production process. That is the central question in Indian environmental movements. So therefore, to understand Indian environmental movement, perhaps what is important to understand this linkage. If you can see this image, you find that there is a linkage between industrialization or industrialism, which results in physical degradation of nature, and the physical degradation of nature results in a crisis in the social sphere, because that also affects the livelihood patterns, because mostly the livelihood is related, is dependent upon natural resources, and it is this loss of livelihood which creates essentially a social crisis, not only an ecological crisis but also a social crisis that results in mobilization of people in a large scale, both for the cause of nature as well as for the cause of livelihood. Because in these cases, as Ramchandra Guha says, that it is difficult perhaps to separate between the concern issues of livelihood and issues of concern for nature. So these network or these nexus between nature and livelihood, that makes Indian environmental movements peculiar, and therefore to understand Indian environmental movements, perhaps we need to understand these linkages between livelihood and degradation of nature. That industrialization or industrial way of life not only creates a physical problem with regard to nature, but also creates a social crisis, a social problem because of its impact on loss of livelihood. Now let us see who are the actors involved in this Indian environmental movement. Let us again draw upon Ramchandra Guha and Madhav Gadgil's framework. Guha and Gadgil in their book Use and Abuse of Nature point out three important actors who are involved in resource use and resource conflicts. These are ecosystem people, the omnivores, and the ecological refugees. Let us understand what are these three categories of people. Ecosystem people are basically those who have a direct dependence upon resource, for whom resource is a source of livelihood, for whom resource is a source of everyday dependence for day-to-day activities. So, these are the people who depend upon resources or local resources to meet their most of the material needs. The omnivores are basically beneficiaries of development. They are maybe the middle class people, they are the urban dwellers who are secondary users of the resource. So, they grow at the cost of the ecosystem people and they draw maximum benefit out of resource extraction or resource degradation. The ecological refugees perhaps is more interesting category. What Ramchandra Guha and Madhav Gadgil say, that ecological refugees are sufferers of development. The ecological refugees perhaps is more interesting category. What Ramchandra Guha and Madhav Gadgil say, that ecological refugees are sufferers of development. Let us take a practical example to understand these categories. Let us consider about a dam. When a dam project happens and a dam creates lot of waterlogging, dam creates creation of a huge reservoir that may result in loss of biodiversity, loss of forest, and dam also creates displacement. So, it is these communities who depend upon resources or depend upon local resources for their day-to-day activities, they are the ecosystem people. Whereas a dam provides electricity, dam provides irrigation. Who are the beneficiaries of these benefits of a dam? It is mostly perhaps rich farmers or middle peasants who stay, let us say, away from the dam. So, in that sense, omnivores are not essentially physically related to the resource. They are not, or they do not exist in a close proximity with the resource, whereas the ecosystem people stay in close proximity with the resource. In fact, they sometimes stay inside the forest, they stay near to the forest, and forest for them is a source of livelihood. And with regard to ecological refuges, let us consider the same example of construction of dam. When a dam is constructed, there are several people who lose their livelihood, there are several people who lose their agricultural land, their homestead land, and they become displaced people. And where do these displaced people go? Sometimes these displaced people become migrants, they go to the nearby city and they are the sufferers of development. And Ramchandra Guha considers this category as ecological refugees. They are displaced people who are forced to migrate to the city, who face the problem of livelihood insecurity, because of shortage of and lack of access to natural resources. And Ramchandra Guha says that Indian environmental movement is mostly conflict between the ecosystem people against the state, the ecological refugees against the state. So, therefore, the major actors involved in Indian environmental movement are these three categories: the ecosystem people, the omnivores, and the ecological refugees. And mostly you will find that these ecological conflicts are mostly a conflict between the ecosystem people and the capitalist state, or the ecological refugees and the capitalist state, because the central issue here is loss of livelihood, insecurity of livelihood, and resource degradation, which creates not only a physical crisis, but also a material crisis in their livelihood. So, to summarize this part of the lecture, what is essential according to Ramchandra Guha to understand Indian environmental movement is its social base, that these movements are not single issue movements, and the central point about Indian environmental movement is the linkage between livelihood and degradation of nature. That degradation of nature creates a crisis in livelihood, and it is this loss of livelihood, the insecurity of livelihood, that results in popular mobilization against environmental degradation. So, therefore, these movements are multifaceted movements. There is a private phase and a public phase. With regard to the public phase, these are essentially green movements, environmental movements, but the private phase, the insider story of these environmental movements are that they are struggle against in defense of local resources. They are struggle for claiming control over the local resources. So, essentially, therefore, Ramchandra Guha says that Indian environmental movements are localized struggles in defense of livelihood, in defense of local space, in defense of local natural resources.